The hut where I sat with the fragile holy man reeked of stale blood and rotting flesh from the animal sacrifices that had been offered there just days before. We sat on the floor, and the high priest began to pray to 5 gods lined up in a row right in front of him. He was muttering softly in Ewe, and I was filled with awe as I watched him sway back and forth in an ancient tradition of worship. The year was 2011, and I was in Ghana to learn cultural things like dancing and drumming. One clear thing I learned was that I am not a dancer and I am not a drummer. What I was interested in learning, though, was that many of the religions of the Iwe people. I was in seminary at the time, and this would serve as an independent study known as contextual theology, a course where we would get outside of our own context and learn about the ways theology is experienced in a different culture than our own. So if I had to sit in a dark grass hut and try not to breathe the rancid odor in order to get this once in a lifetime opportunity to interview the high priest of the local Burkite religion, I would do it. A few days later, I went to a local Pentecostal church to worship at their Sunday service. During an interview with an elder in the church, I discovered that Christianity looks much different to them than it did to me. To me, idols are things like work or sports or celebrities or money. To them, idols are actual gods that are carried around in positions of honor for all to see and bow down to. The Christians in this village warned me not to have a meal with anyone who practices the Burkite religion. After all, you don't know whether the meat that they serve you has first been offered to one of the tribal gods. What would happen, I asked, if I knew that the meat had been offered to an idol, but I was hungry and it smelled good? What if I decided to eat the meat anyway? The elder got a stern look on his face. You will be on your own then, he said. God will not protect you from the bad things that might happen to you until you repent and ask for deliverance from the evil spirits that came into your body with the meat. When I heard this, I wanted to show the Ghanaian Christians the passage in 1 Corinthians that says we shouldn't worry about meat offered to idols because the idols aren't really gods and they don't actually defile the meat. I wondered if this bit of revelation would be a source of strength that might free the Ghanaian people to just enjoy the food that's offered to them, regardless of where it came from. After all, food is scarce enough in the village without worrying about idols. But I stopped myself. I was there to learn, not to teach. Instead of trying to rescue people from what I thought was an archaic set of beliefs, I needed to step back and pay attention to where these people were coming from. Many of the Christians I met in Ghana had spent most of their lives worshiping the gods of the Burkite religion, offering animal sacrifices as a form of worship and tradition. When they were telling me that this meat was defiled, it was because that to them, it was defiled. Who was I to come in with my Western context, with my foreign perspective and tell them that they're just being foolish? How much can I really learn when my mouth is moving? As I think about this experience in Ghana, there are several questions that come up to me. And at what point do my own beliefs, as sacred as they are to me, become destructive to other people? What happens to me when I refuse to respect someone else's beliefs? And finally, what is the best way to show love when what I really want is to be right? The Apostle Paul gets mixed reviews. Some people love him, while others want to kick him in the kneecaps. The topic I'm presenting today comes from one of his letters to the Christians in Corinth. But if you don't like Paul, you probably have good reasons and some baggage to go along with it. But hang in there with me, because I think there's a lesson in what he has to say that we can all stand to be reminded of, no matter how our theology differs from Paul's. 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 11. This is an abridged kind of a selected verses from that passage. He says, now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we possess all knowledge. That was in quotes. But knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, for us there is but one God. But not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And because they believe that that food is defiled, it is. Be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all of your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? If so, this person will be destroyed by your knowledge. In the reading that I shared before the message, I introduced you to Ted Kapchik, who conducted a study to compare the effectiveness of prescription medication to the effectiveness of acupuncture. Some participants reported feeling much worse, and some reported feeling much better. But neither group's results had anything to do with the type of procedure that they received. In fact, all the participants received placebo treatments. The difference was that one group was told that the treatment may cause them to feel worse, and the other group was told that the treatment may cause them to feel better. When the results came back, it was shocking how many people actually experienced the results that they were told that they should expect. There's an interesting thing that happens when someone takes a placebo. If a person believes that the placebo is real medicine, they may actually start feeling better after having taken the pill. This is called a placebo effect, which is what Dr. Kapchuk actually studies. But have you ever heard the term nocebo? N-O-C-E-B-O. It's the opposite of placebo, and it describes the harmful effects that result from a harmless substance. If a doctor says that she's going to prescribe a pill that will cause the patient severe intestinal distress, and then gives them a harmless sugar pill, when the patient takes the pill, it will likely cause them severe intestinal distress. A doctor is usually a person that we trust to tell us the truth. So it's not uncommon for someone to actually believe their doctor to such an extent that what the doctor says is indeed what the patient experiences. If someone truly believes that something will harm them, then that belief will manifest in physical, emotional, or spiritual ways. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul talks about the effects that belief can have on a person. You see, there were a lot of people in the early church who, just like the Christians in Ghana that I met, had spent most of their lives offering animal sacrifices as a form of worship to various gods before they converted to Christianity. And even after their beliefs about God changed, they were still convinced based on many years of traditional worship practices, that eating the meat offered to idols was a form of actually worshiping those idols. But then there were people who grew up in the Jewish tradition and who, similar to my own experience, had never sacrificed meat to idols. It was just kind of a thing of interest, an intelligence kind of thing. So to them, it didn't really matter what kind of worship rituals the meat had been through. There was only one true God in their minds, and everything else was just superstition. They knew that nothing was going to happen if they ate the meat, so they did so freely, even going so far as to eat the meat right there in the middle of the pagan marketplace. It was their way of saying, see, these gods aren't real. Look at me, I'm eating the meat and nothing's happening to me because I worship the only true God that exists. Pass me another rack of ribs, these are delicious. What these folks were trying to do, it seems, is to demonstrate the freedom that they had in their new enlightenment. They were free to eat any meat that was offered to them, and they tried to convince the new converts to do the same. The problem was that the new converts were still so scared to death of the meat that was offered to idols. All they had to do was look at the stuff, and it seemed to radiate with supernatural forces. So here you have two different kinds of Christians who worship the same God, but who have vastly different backgrounds and beliefs about whether eating meat offered to idols is a form of idol worship that defiles the body. Someone probably wrote to Paul, asking him to write back and convince these immature new Christians that they have nothing to worry about. Surely they would listen to him because he was supposed to be the expert. Consider him the doctor in the room. But instead, we see him writing back and addressing the people who had grown up in the Jewish tradition and who were themselves acting immaturely by flaunting their religious freedom. In 1 Corinthians 8, he says, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, but not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And because they believe that, the food is defiled. Paul knew how powerful a person's belief system is. And he knew that if anyone were to convince the new converts to eat the idol's meat, they might feel pretty proud of themselves for having offered them freedom, but they would actually be destroying people's consciences without knowing how much damage they're actually causing. Let's make this a little more personal, shall we? If I were to have convinced the Pentecostal Christians in Ghana to eat the meat offered to idols, it's quite possible that they would have experienced significant spiritual alienation from their own God as a result, because that's what they would have expected to happen. Let me ask you this: how much freedom does that actually give them in the end? In our American culture, we don't run into too many people who tell us that they're concerned about eating meat offered to idols. But there are other things that we have been conditioned to fear in a similar way. For instance, when we were kids, some of us were sternly warned about the dangers of playing with a Ouija board. Some people claim that it's demonic and that it invites evil spirits to take over your body. Many people hold strongly to two powerful beliefs, which are seemingly contradictory. On one hand, they believe that there is only one true God and that God is all-powerful and that nothing can separate them from the love of God. On the other hand, they believe that there are certain things that we can do that is just inviting trouble to mess up their lives. If they engage in these practices willingly, they could distance themselves from God. They would just be inviting spiritual calamity. Playing with a Ouija board is one of those things that strikes fear into the hearts of some of the most staunchly religious people. Play with one of those things, they say, and you will have defiled your body and soul. You're on your own. God will not protect you from anything that happens as a result of that kind of intentional rebellion. Does this sound familiar? This is exactly what the Ghanaian Christians were saying about meat offered to idols. Skeptics have rejected the idea that any connection exists between the Ouija board and supernatural forces. Only gullible people would believe such a thing, they say. Some enlightened people have actually gone so far as to play the game in front of frightened onlookers just to prove that their fears are unwarranted. The thing that Paul is trying to say to the people in Corinth is that even if we are convinced that evil spirits don't exist, much less that they enter the body through meat or through a Ouija board or any other such thing, we should avoid doing these things in the presence of people who are convinced otherwise. When we don't respect each other's beliefs as much as we respect our own, we are completely disregarding the power of a person's convictions. For their sake, it's better not to eat the meat, not to play with the Ouija board, than to show them how enlightened we are. But our arrogance and intolerance doesn't just affect other people. Something happens inside of us when we refuse to respect someone else's beliefs. You see, both groups of people in Corinth thought that they were best representing God's view of meat offered to idols. Those who did not eat the meat insisted that their abstinence demonstrated more spiritual strength than those who ate the meat. Those who ate insisted that their enjoyment of the meat demonstrated more spiritual freedom and maturity. Paul finds himself in the middle of a very heated argument. He had spent a lot of time in his career talking about spiritual freedom, but now he needed to do a little bit of damage control and address spiritual pride. He says, we know that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. In other words, if you think it's better to be right than to show love, then all of your knowledge is wasted. A famous preacher used to say, some people grow, others just swell. Are we puffed up in our knowledge? Do we look down on others who don't know as much as we do? Paul insists that love trumps knowledge. So if we really want to help people, we will shut up and show love. The Dalai Lama also combines love and freedom by saying, the more you are motivated by love, the more fearless and free your action will be. A good life is not characterized by how much you know, or how strong you are, or how much liberty you possess, but rather how much you love. But all of this is much easier said than done, right? One time there was a little girl who was deep in concentration over her drawing. Her mother asked her what she was drawing, and she said, God. Her mother was confused and said, but no one knows what God looks like. The little girl replied, well, they will now. How tempting is it to think that we know it all? When we have experienced a breakthrough or attained a new level of enlightenment in our personal lives, it is an exciting and beautiful thing. It is a mark of growth. But then we may try to hold everyone up to the standard that we have reached. But in Buddhism, we learn that love nourishes spiritual freedom. As the Dalai Lama says, Love is the absence of judgment. Perhaps this is what he had in mind when he said that his religion is kindness. Are we puffed up in our knowledge? Do we look down on others who don't know as much as we do? Paul insists that love trumps knowledge. So if we really want to help someone, we will be quiet and just show them love. Thank you.